What's good, my people? It's been a little while. My bad that I've been missing for like a week, going on two now, but kind of had a couple things that I had to deal with that took higher priority. But, anyways, we back and better than ever. I know a lot of stuff been going on, especially in the world of, let's call it, gimmick fighting. But right now, I really wanted to hone in onto the UFC's flyweight division and discuss some of my thoughts on what's been going on with that, especially in the post Pantoja era, quote unquote. Ever since Pantoja's freak injury that went on recently at the close to the end of the year, I know that a lot of us kind of have been in that state where we're wondering what's next. Yeah, Joshua Van is now technically the current active champion for that division. And in a sense, he was one of the people who the UFC wanted to push for that position as well. However, following the way how he got that title, many people, myself included, can't really officially acknowledge him as the actual champion of the division, seeing as he's arguably only in that position due to Pantoja's freak arm injury that ended up occurring. I know there's people who would argue that, well, that was a moment caused by Van by catching the kick and forcing Pantoja to try to cushion his fall with his arm. However, we all have to be honest. That fight didn't last any time. Joshua Van didn't do anything relevant besides just putting Pantoja off balance that was rightfully cause an injury or a fight ending maneuver. At best, the only thing that Joshua Van did was not get steamrolled immediately, because we saw who was pushing the initial tempo and pace of that fight. However, due to the way how that fight ended up, there's a lot of different possible plot lines that the UFC was attempting to set up that right now maybe a little bit made the flyweight a bit convoluted. To begin with, Pantoja, being the former champion at this point, was on a historic run, being the first flyweight we've ever seen in recent time that had the potential to compete with Demetrius Johnson as far as legacy in any capacity. Yes, I understand that Pantoja wasn't even halfway towards what Demetrius Johnson had in title defenses. However, the absolute domination as well as the quality of competition that he was doing it against had Pantoja at this point already certified himself as the second greatest flyweight of all time and was making that campaign for being the greatest of all time, even though he was not yet at that venture. When we look into the current title picture, we got four fighters specifically who are kind of in the mix right now. I'm saying four because I'm still including Alexandre Pantoja himself, despite the freak injury, because it's already been guaranteed by Dana White that the moment he comes back, that he's first in line for a title opportunity. So to begin with, I'll list off the four fighters that are in this current title picture, as well as moving the people who are leading the division right now. We have Joshua Van, who is the current active flyweight champion, and as well as been on kind of a legendary run himself, being, I believe, at this point, the second youngest UFC champion in UFC history. He has a very exciting fighting style. He kind of brings a lot of the aspects that led people to love somebody like Figueiredo back in the day. Devastating knockouts, quick to get back in the ring. He's already been in legendary firefights like the one we saw against Brandon Royval earlier this year. We have seen a lot of little excitements and things to look forward to despite his relatively short tenure in the UFC's division. But the real test for him was Pantoja. A lot of people wanted to see if he was capable of overcoming a legend like Pantoja, somebody who not only has power and aggression, but also is even more well-rounded than when he beat Brandon Royval. Because in a lot of people's minds, that Royval fight did have a bit of luck. Royval at the final moments decided to be a lot more greedy and be a lot more engaging in the fight, that a lot of people argue he was winning up to that point of being knocked down in the third. And that was where Van was able to kind of edge it out and put the stamp on it and win that fight. It was a very close fight, and we haven't seen somebody on the caliber of Pantoja have a genuinely close fight since his bout against Steve Erceg. Then we have the next person in line that a lot of people had eyes on in Tatsuro Taira, or as we like to call him over here, the Great Japanese Hope. Now, when I say that, this isn't necessarily just some race thing. When you look at it, the UFC have been trying to break into the Japanese market for a very long time now. If we had to pick the markets that the UFC have been constantly trying to carve out a pathway in, it would be the Mexican market and the Japanese market would probably be the top two areas that MMA's premier organization, the UFC, have been attempting to stake a claim in for quite a while now. Back in the Pride days, the Japanese market was basically the fight hub of the entire world for MMA. But now, since the UFC has become more of a global sensation, it's kind of lost it a bit when it comes to the East and the fight culture over there. We see organizations like ONE FC kind of having a bit more domination in that area, but the UFC have really been trying to crack into the market. Even somebody like Kai Asakura, who the UFC brought up over and immediately gave a title opportunity, despite being unproven, was somebody who the UFC was attempting to utilize in order to crack into that market. There is a huge fight culture in Japan, and right now, undoubtedly, Tatsuro Taira is the best opportunity at cracking into that. He was initially what they were trying to push, but he got defeated by Brandon Royval. And then that's why when it came to Tatsuro Taira, they decided, let's set him to the side for a bit. Let's try to have Kai Asakura just skip over everybody, because flyweight is too good and too dangerous of a division at the top for them to risk just that opportunity initially. Turns out that Pantoja ran through him like nothing and killed that in the water. But now, after Tatsuro Taira can manage to beat somebody who was a huge fan favorite, is a huge fan favorite, like a Brandon Moreno, who was on a bit of a resurgence himself, having that number 3 rank, and Tatsuro Taira was able to overcome that challenge, he had already solidified himself as the next in line, at least at that point in time. And it was kind of seen like a showing of, okay, then whoever wins versus Pantoja versus Van would go right in against Tatsuro Taira afterwards. However, we have a little bit of a mix-up that ended up happening, and that's with the next fighter that I want to discuss, which is a Manel Kape. Initially, Starboy was supposed to be the real savior of the flyweight division that the UFC initially tried to push. Manel Kape, who was already well known in the East himself, he himself has both lost and beaten somebody like Kai Asakura prior to joining the UFC. He had his own name. His fight style is very exciting, devastating knockouts, incredible speed. He was somebody who the UFC wanted to push from the very beginning, prior to even Asakura and Taira making it over. Manel Kape was supposed to be a bit of that global superstar that UFC was trying to put in. However, he met his blockade early by facing Juan Alexandre Pantoja for his first fight in the organization, and he got stopped then. So when you look at it, a lot of these fighters have either been stopped by Pantoja himself or stopped by opponents that Pantoja's overcome. That was why Tatsuro Taira being stopped by Brandon Royval ended up presenting an issue, because that was somebody who Pantoja has cleared twice. Then you have Cop, who Pantoja's already beaten, and then with him constantly pulling out every time when the UFC attempted to give him an opportunity to build him back up, it created a lot of difficulties. It mixed in with controversies, even that whole situation that he had with all just the flyweight contenders. You see a lot of little issues on a lot of the people that the UFC tries to build for the flyweight division. While Pantoja is an excellent champion and a phenomenal fighter, personality-wise, he's too calm for the UFC's desire for publicity and star power. Pantoja is the epitome of a man-made star, in the aspect of he just kept winning to the point that he developed a fan base eventually. They just one of those situations where he just simply was becoming undeniable. He never was the first option. He was the option that became first. When you look at Pantoja, that freak arm injury happened at the time when the UFC and the fans were finally getting behind him to the point of pushing him for the possibilities of what he could become, i.e., the new GOAT of that division. However, right now, I personally don't think that the arm injury is that big of a setback. I personally think Pantoja should take the entire next year off and rebuild his body stronger and better than ever. I think Pantoja has everything it takes to come back and go on a completely new type of tier through the division. But I believe rushing back and risking being finished and re-injured and actually sabotaging your legacy is a much greater risk versus what he could be doing in resting, allow the division to progress without him, and then after he's ready, then you come back and then you start from the top down. One of the issues that Pantoja was facing during his reign was that he was too good. He'd already cleared the division to the point that even when that Steve Erceg fight occurred, Pantoja cleared the division on his way up. So he had to start back just lapping it. But now that we have a new champion in Joshua Van, we have these new matchups going on. With initially Tatsuro Taira was supposed to be the first in line. They had the face-off. Everything was there. Either way, they would have not only broken into the Asian market regardless of the winner, but because of the fight styles of them both, with Joshua Van's destructive power and then Tatsuro Taira's well-rounded skill set and his background, and that tied to the finally having somebody for the Japanese market. It was a win-win either way. They both had fan-friendly styles and the type of backgrounds that the UFC foams over. But Manel Cap threw a wrench into that. Both Tatsuro Taira and Brandon Royval, despite the fact that Royval beat Taira dominating Moreno in the way that he did, immediately put him back in the contender out for a lot of people. Royval, on the other hand, his biggest blockade was Alexandre Pantoja. If Royval had gotten past Manel Cap, Royval would have been the next in line. However, he got stopped, and he got stopped really easily. Manel Cap looked ferocious. He looked fast. He looked powerful. You looked at Manel Cap, and he looked overwhelming. He looked like exactly what the UFC hoped he would have been initially. The destroyer who would have taken over the division. He also looks a little flabby in this area. Look like he might be juicing a little bit. But as I've always said before, if we don't have any proof that they're on steroids, then we can't use it against them. So as far as we know, Manel Cap is natty. He's clean as a whistle. But when you look at it, Manel Cap had the more convincing performance out of him and Tatsuro Taira. And he's also been the fighter who's been being built for longer. He is the first option. The other options developed as better routes because they were more consistent. But right now, with Manel Cap like fully staking his claim, with him finally coming through this division, with him finally getting to the top, officially in the top 5 now, at a time when Alexandre Pantoja is currently predisposed, this is what I think should happen. I think Pantoja should take this year as a rest. I believe that the very next fight, and I believe it should be made swiftly. You see a little chirping back and forth between Manel Cap and with my boy Joshua Van. And Manel Cap said, let's do it in February, and Joshua Van is already accepted as far as verbally. I think that's the next fight. Let's put Tatsuro Taira on pause for now. Have Joshua Van versus Manel Cap. Then the winner of that fight should face Tatsuro Taira. Then after that, I believe that if he's ready, that's when Pantoja should come back and face whoever's the winner of that. Allow the division to progress and allow the person that you face and you rematch against Alexandre Pantoja to be somebody who's truly worthy of the potential legacy that we claim that Pantoja was achieving. As far as how I see these matchups going, if I'm being perfectly honest, I actually think that it's very unlikely that in the rematch between, or let me correct myself, in the match that Pantoja will inevitably have, as long as he continues fighting and comes back after this injury, that matchup against the current champion at the time, I honestly don't believe it will be Joshua Van. I think skill for skill wise, Joshua Van is the least skilled of these 4 contenders on a technical level. When I look at Joshua Van, Tatsuro Taira, Manel Cap, and Alexandre Pantoja, of these 4, Joshua Van, skill for skill wise, is the most lacking. The biggest differentiator is his devastating power. Yes, his boxing is very sharp, very accurate. However, as we've seen in the Brandon Royval fight, he still gets hit. He gets hit a lot. And despite all of that, while he has decent takedown defense, somebody knows how to mix it well, mix the kicks well, you can very much push him back. In that aspect, Tatsuro Taira is a nightmare matchup for him. I believe Tatsuro Taira, while not being faster straight up with the hands in the striking arena, I think he's faster everywhere else. I think he has better takedowns. I think he's more technical in the aspect that he has a better reading of the counters and the timings. I believe that he's capable of mixing up the skill set and the arts a lot better. I believe that Van will struggle a lot with not just landing cleanly against Taira, but also dealing with the wide array of skill set. Van's power is devastating. He is capable of knocking out anybody in the flyweight division. So there's always that quote-unquote puncher's chance. But if we're talking about what's most likely, I believe it's unlikely that he'll land that against a Tatsuro Taira. When we look at Van versus Cap, on the other hand, I think Cap is just too fast. Cap, just like Van, has devastating knockout power and is fully capable of shutting the lights off and ending the fight swiftly. However, unlike with Joshua Van, Cap also has much better kicks, in my opinion. He's much more varied in the arts. I believe Cap has better takedown defense, and I think Cap has a wider variety. Better knees, not just striking. Better knees, better kicks, better elbows. Better sense of when to utilize grappling, even if it's just clinch work. Overall, it's too wide a variety. If Cap ends up going shot for shot with Van, they could knock each other out. Then it becomes a who gets hit first. It's kind of going to be a bit similar to that Ibo Aslan fight a few cards ago. However, Cap finally getting the opportunity, I believe that he'd land first. I believe that he would be more aggressive in that. And we've seen Joshua Van kind of back away when it comes to somebody who's even more aggressive than him if he's not able to land a counter at that right moment. Even in the beginning of that Alexandre Pantoja fight, we saw Pantoja immediately force Van backwards without fear. While Van might be called the fearless, whenever he faces high-level opponents, they always seem to have moments where they're forcing him back when they decide to be without fear. I see most likely if Van goes against Cap, honestly, I think Cap wins. I think it's his higher chance of winning against Cap than he does against Tatsuro Taira. Reason for that is because I believe Manel Cap, also being somebody who relies heavily on his power, would be significantly more willing to directly engage with him. And by doing so would also become a lot more at risk with that situation and could potentially get knocked out himself in that clash. However, when he goes against Tatsuro Taira, I think Taira would be a lot more patient, a lot more cognitive, a lot more intentional, a lot more strategic in his approach. I think if we go matchup wise, Van versus Taira is a terrible matchup for him. Whereas Van versus Cap is just a less than ideal matchup for him. I think he has very much is capable of winning both fights. I just think it's very unlikely. As far as Cap versus Taira, if Cap manages to get past Van and then he goes against Taira, I think Cap would beat Taira. I think Cap versus Taira is a much easier matchup for Cap than Cap versus Van, ironically, because Taira doesn't possess the same level of knockout power as Joshua Van does. Meaning that Manel Cap, somebody who tends to really freestyle a lot more once he gets too comfortable in there, he'd have a lot less risk and a lot less to be wary of as he starts feeling himself in this matchup against a Taira than he would with a Van, which would open up his entire skill set a lot more. You would see him push the aggression much more. You would see that he'd have significantly more, let's call it, in the zone, or when you really see for those who watch Dragon Ball Z, you see that, call it the Ultra Instinct. That's when you'd see Cap go into these modes a lot more once the opponent he's going against doesn't present the same level of danger and risk as far as speed or power. Whereas Taira is fast and faster than somebody like a Van is. However, the speed difference between Cap and Taira are comparable at worst. Taira would not have a big enough speed advantage to really get past Cap, and he definitely doesn't have the power advantage to keep him honest. I think Cap would just overwhelm him, eventually wear him down, and just land clean enough. I think Cap is most likely the person who will face Pantoja on his return. And if that happens, regardless of who of these three emerges, I expect Alexandre Pantoja to win. Pantoja, durability-wise, is not somebody who we see getting shaken by fist a lot. The last time we saw Pantoja get rocked by shots was in his matchup against Figueiredo many years ago. Since then, we've watched Pantoja run through that division. We saw how swiftly he put it on Van. I think that he would get the finish early. Same thing with a Manel Cap. I think speed-wise, Manel Cap is significantly faster than Pantoja. But because of Pantoja's behemoth style and his willingness to engage, I think Pantoja would force grappling and immediately catch Manel Cap in a compromising position, especially with how aggressive he tends to be, would lead him to be a lot more open to potential setups and dangerous compromising positions. Similar to what we kind of saw in the matchup against Kai Kara France, in which Pantoja just marched him down and he tried to stave him off, and by trying to fight him off, he just got caught eventually. I see a similar type of finish coming against Cap in if he fought Pantoja. And then when it comes to a Tatsuro Taira, I just got to be honest. I don't see Taira having any specific advantage that would make him beat a Pantoja. I know in the past, Tatsuro Taira stated that he believes that he's more skilled than Pantoja everywhere, but I honestly don't believe that. I think that Tatsuro Taira is more technical in the aspect that he's more by the book in how he does things. He has a cleaner, more 1-2 striking. His grappling looks better. It looks more by the book of how you learn it. But Pantoja's is simply more effective. It just is. There's a reason why he set all the finishing and submission records that he did in the UFC's flyweight division. I actually think Cap is approaching the knockout record as well. But when you look at Tatsuro Taira, his biggest advantage is his grappling. However, he's not a more effective grappler than Alexandre Pantoja. He wouldn't. I find it very unlikely that Tatsuro Taira would submit Pantoja, but I don't find it unlikely that Pantoja could submit Taira. He's not stronger than Pantoja. He's not going to outmuscle him. While he might be a better technical striker than Pantoja, he's not a more effective striker than Pantoja. Because if, for example, by technical I mean, if Tatsuro Taira will line his shots up, traditional boxing, he'll get the shots, he'll set you up, use a jab. Pantoja will just swing at you, and when it connects, it connects. But because he's so berserk in how he attempts and how he goes straight at you, you don't have time to think, you don't have time to counter. And Tatsuro Taira is not a good enough striker in which he could that easily find the opening in these chaotic flurries like a Joshua Van or even a Manel Cap would be able to. So if anything, I'd probably say Tatsuro Taira is the worst possible matchup for an Alexandre Pantoja of these three. I'd argue that the best possible matchup would probably be, ironically, Joshua Van probably is the hardest matchup for Pantoja of these three due to his counters, his highly technical boxing, and then just that power that is a constant threat. Joshua Van is probably the person of these three with the highest likelihood of defeating an Alexandre Pantoja. I don't see any of these three beating him upon his return, but it definitely is interesting to see how this division will continue progressing. For this next year, let's keep an eye on flyweight, and let's see who's actually going to come to the top. Hopefully, Pantoja doesn't rush his return too much and does the proper healing that he needs. We can all see some that's potentially legendary. That's my thoughts. It's great to be back, guys. Until next time, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Comment on the comment section what y'all think. Am I talking BS? Y'all agree with? What y'all disagree with? Until next time, peace.